The war had already been decided before she landed. That's what they told her on the transport. The Galactic Accord had voted 14 species, 47 planetary systems, one unanimous decision. Earth would send a single representative to the Meridian Threshold, the neutral ground between the Vorath Dominion's front line and what remained of the Allied perimeter. One human, unarmed by treaty. And she would stand before Warlord Kethavar of the Vorath, a creature that had glassed 3 moons in his career, who had once executed his own generals for retreating, and she would speak on behalf of a species that the rest of the galaxy had already written off. Lieutenant Commander Mara Voss, 34 years old, former combat medic, Cascade Station incident. Xenolinguistics specialist, 3 years service on the Accord's diplomatic circuit. 5'6", brown hair that she never quite managed to keep regulation length. A small scar above her left eyebrow from a piece of shrapnel she'd caught in the Jovian corridor skirmishes 7 years ago, when Earth had its first and only experience of alien warfare before this moment arrived. She wasn't chosen because she was Earth's best warrior. She wasn't chosen because she was its most powerful diplomat either. She was chosen because she was the only person in the entire selection pool who, when they handed her the mission briefing, 40 pages, classified, describing exactly what Kethavar had done to the last 3 delegations sent to negotiate with him, had read every single page, set the document on the table, and said quietly, "Okay, when do I leave?" No tremor in her voice. No bravado either. She hadn't puffed up, hadn't squared her shoulders like someone auditioning for courage. She just asked the practical question, the way you'd ask about a bus schedule. That was the moment they knew she was the one. The transport was a Kelvari vessel, elegant, sweeping lines, pale gold hull plating that caught light like a seashell. The Kelvari were one of the 14 species of the Accord, long-limbed, with large amber eyes and a bioluminescent ridge that ran from crown to spine. Their ship smelled faintly of something between cedar and seawater. Mara had always liked the Kelvari. They were honest. They told you uncomfortable things without being cruel about it. Her escort was a Kelvari named Chevelin, senior diplomatic attaché, 40 years service. When Chevelin met her at the airlock, the bioluminescent ridge was cycling through slow, dim amber, the Kelvari equivalent of a held breath. "Commander Voss," Chevelin said, and her voice was careful, the way you'd talk to someone you respected and also pitied. "Chevelin," Mara shook her hand, the human gesture which the Kelvari had learned to accept gracefully. "You look worried." "I am worried." "Good, worried means you're paying attention." Chevelin blinked her large amber eyes slowly. "You understand what you are walking into." "I read the briefing." "Then you understand that Kethavar has already communicated, privately, through back channels, that this negotiation is a formality. He intends to accept Earth's surrender and incorporate humanity into the Vorath Dominion as a labor class. His exact words, translated, were, "Send whoever you like, it won't change the arithmetic." Mara quoted it back from memory, page 12 of the briefing. "Yeah, I caught that." Chevelin's ridge dimmed further. "And you are not?" "I'm not anything, Sheva. I'm just getting on the ship." Mara picked up her single bag, standard-issue diplomatic carry, gray, unremarkable, and walked past her toward the boarding ramp. "Are you going to show me my cabin, or are we going to stand here while you finish being sad at me?" She spent the 3-day transit studying. Not strategy documents. She'd already absorbed those. She spent it watching footage, everything the Accord's intelligence network had compiled on Kethavar. Not the tactical assessments, not the weapons manifests of his fleet, the personal footage, the moments between battles. There was a clip from a post-victory gathering on his flagship, the Meridian's grief, 4 years ago. Kethavar standing on an elevated platform, his generals arrayed behind him, addressing the assembled command staff. He was massive by human standards, nearly 3 meters tall, the Vorath built dense and angular like something geology had made, not biology. Their exoskeletal plates were matte black, absorbing light, and their eyes were compound, faceted, copper-colored, catching the ship's overhead lighting in fractal patterns. He spoke for 23 minutes. She watched it 4 times. Not to understand his words, the translation software handled that. She watched him, the way he moved his hands, the cadence of his pauses, the moments he looked directly at a specific general versus the moments he addressed the group. The micro-expressions that translated even across species lines, because the Vorath, for all their alienness, had evolved the same fundamental biological architecture of hierarchy and dominance that most social species eventually converged on. He was brilliant. She could see that immediately. Not the blunt instrument the Accord briefings painted him as. He was layered, deliberate, precise. He used theatrical anger the way a conductor uses a baton. He knew exactly when to let silence fall and when to fill it. He was also profoundly certain. That was the thing she kept coming back to. He had the certainty of someone who had never, in his entire career, been genuinely surprised. Every campaign calculated, every variable controlled, every opponent reduced to a problem he'd already solved in a previous form. She watched the clip a fifth time, and she thought about what certainty does to a person, any being. It makes you stop looking. The Meridian Threshold was a space station the size of a small city, hung in the gravitational neutral between two star systems like a comma in a sentence. It was ancient, older than the Vorath Dominion, older than the Accord, built by a species no one remembered anymore, who had apparently believed that somewhere to put things down and talk was infrastructure worth investing in. The station had 17 inhabited levels. When Mara arrived, the upper 4 were Vorath military. She could feel the mass of them as soon as the airlock opened, the way you feel a weather front coming in. 12,000 soldiers quartered there, plus the Warlord's personal guard, the Kethari, 40 warriors who had served Kethavar personally for more than a decade, who had survived every campaign he'd run and were reportedly so conditioned to violence that they didn't sleep in the normal sense, just cycled through combat readiness states. The Accord's delegation occupied Level 8, a conference suite, a sleeping quarter, a small common room. Spartan by Accord standards, which meant it was nicer than most field hospitals Myra had worked out of. Shevelin briefed her on the protocol as they walked the corridor to her room. The meeting is set for tomorrow, station morning. The Warlord's representatives have stipulated no recording devices, no translation aids beyond your implant, no advisory communication during the session. You will be in the room alone with Kethavar and his personal interpreter, Vorath-designate Vel. You will have a maximum of 2 standard hours. What happens at the 2-hour mark? The Vorath have stated that if no agreement is reached, they will consider the negotiation concluded and proceed on their current military timeline. Which means... Shevelin's ridge went dark. The Vorath fleet moves on Earth's outer relay stations within 72 hours. Mara set her bag on the bed, sat down. Okay. Commander Voss, Shevelin's voice went quiet. I want to say something that is outside my diplomatic function. Then say it as a person, not a diplomat. The Kelvari was still for a moment. Her ridge flickered a strange, complex pattern. When I was assigned to this mission, I reviewed your record, all of it. The Cascade Station incident, the field reports from the Jovian corridor, your work on the translation protocols in Year 4 of the Accord Circuit. A pause. You are one of the most capable individuals of any species that I have worked alongside in 40 years. I hear a but coming. Kethavar has faced 42 formal diplomatic challenges in his career. He has won all 42. Several of those challengers were military commanders with far greater tactical resources than you have access to. One was a Drothi mind speaker, a species capable of direct neural persuasion. He was not persuaded. Mara looked at the ceiling. It was the same pale gold material as the hull, and someone had etched something into it in a script she didn't recognize. Old writing. The forgotten people who built this place. You're trying to tell me something, she said. I am trying to tell you that it is acceptable to be afraid, and that the Accord will not think less of you if you spend these hours in whatever way brings you comfort rather than preparation. Because preparation, Shevelin stopped herself. Because preparation might not help, Mara finished for her. That's what you're actually saying. A long pause, then, yes. Mara nodded slowly. Thank you for being honest with me. Of course. Now go get some sleep, Sheva. One of us should. She didn't sleep, she didn't try to. She ate. The transport had stocked human rations, and she ate without tasting them mechanically because she knew she needed the fuel. She drank water. She did 40 minutes of exercise in the small room, quiet movements that kept her body from tightening up. She sat with her back against the wall and she thought. Not about tactics, not about arguments she'd prepared. She thought about her grandmother, which surprised her a little, her grandmother, who had been a coal miner's daughter in a small town in Silesia, who had come to Germany after the war with nothing but a headscarf and a recipe for bread, who had raised 5 children in a 2-room apartment and worked until her hands were cracked as old leather, and who had told Mara once, when Mara was 8 years old and afraid of a thunderstorm. The thunder doesn't know you're scared, so you don't have to show it. It was such a simple thing. She'd never told anyone about it. It seemed too small to be important. But she'd thought of it in the Jovian corridor when the Veth patrol craft had bracketed her medical shuttle. And she'd thought of it at Cascade Station when the hull was coming apart in the secondary sector, and people were screaming in 6 languages, including one she didn't speak. And she'd thought of it when they slid the mission briefing across the table to her in Geneva. The thunder doesn't know you're scared. She sat with that for a long time, in the quiet, in the pale gold room, while 12,000 Vorath soldiers slept above her head. The conference chamber was on level 10, a concession to the Vorath, since their delegation occupied levels 11 through 14, and it put the meeting on the edge of their territory. Mara had expected it to be designed to intimidate, and it was, in the sense that everything about Vorath architecture was designed to communicate scale. The ceilings were high, the table was obsidian dark and enormous, and the lighting was cold blue-white, which the Vorath found comfortable and most other species found slightly clinical. But the room was also just a room. She'd been in worse. She arrived 7 minutes early, which was intentional. She wanted to be there first. She wanted to choose her position at the table, settle in, let the room become familiar before Kethavar filled it. She sat at what would have been the middle of the table's long side, not at the head, not defensively at the far end, but center. She set her hands flat on the table. She felt the temperature of the material, cool, faintly vibrating, like the station's power systems were running just below the surface. She breathed. She was still breathing, quietly, hands flat, when the doors at the far end of the chamber opened. Kethavar was larger in person. She'd known the dimensions intellectually, nearly 3 meters, heavily built, the Vorath exoskeletal plating catching the cold light and fracturing it into prismatic patterns across the ceiling. But there's something about a being of that size and density actually occupying the same air as you that the numbers don't prepare you for. The room shrank. The air changed. He had 4 Kethari with him, down from his usual guard complement of 8, which was itself a statement, because it said he didn't consider her a meaningful security risk. His interpreter, Vel, was a smaller Vorath, barely 2 meters, with elaborate rank markings etched into the plating at his collar. Kethavar looked at her. She looked back. That was the first thing that surprised him. She registered it immediately, the fractional pause in his approach, the slight shift in his compound eye's focal pattern. He'd expected her to do something with her gaze, drop it or harden it, or do the thing frightened beings did where they made their eyes large and still. She did none of those things. She just looked at him the way you'd look at a complicated problem you were genuinely interested in. He took his position at the opposite side of the table, standing, because the Vorath in formal settings never sat until they chose to, and not sitting was a dominant signal so old in their culture it was basically automatic. His Kethari positioned themselves at his flanks. Vel stood to his right. Mara had not stood when he entered. She'd considered it and decided against it. Not as a challenge, she wasn't trying to provoke him. But standing felt like a response to him, and she didn't want to respond. She wanted to just be here in the room, separate from the choreography he was used to. Vel spoke first, standard formal Vorath, translated by her implant with a half-second lag. You are the human representative, designated to speak for the species called Earth. I am. The Warlord Kethavar, commander of the 4th Dominion Fleet, conqueror of the Chevra Compact, architect of the... I know who he is, Mara said pleasantly. We can skip the list. A silence. A very specific kind of silence. The kind that happens when something unexpected lands in a space designed for expected things. Vel's plates shifted, the Vorath equivalent of blinking in surprise. One of the Kethari moved, half a step, reflexive. Kethavar's compound eyes refocused on her, and she watched the pattern in them change, not anger, not yet, just recalibration. She'd stepped outside the expected protocol, and he was integrating that new data point. She waited. He spoke, Vel translated. The human has read her briefings. The human has, Mara agreed. Then the human understands the position she is in. The human understands the position you're in, Mara said, which is probably a more useful starting point. Another silence, different texture this time. She was watching his hands, massive, articulated at more points than human fingers, capable of crushing things that human hands couldn't even hold, and they had gone very still. Still was interesting, still meant thinking. Let me tell you something about the 2 hours that followed, because I've read the transcripts. The station's automated systems recorded audio despite the treaty stipulation, a fact the Accord discovered later and chose not to flag. And I've read them more times than is probably healthy for someone who wasn't in the room. What happened in that room wasn't a negotiation in any form Kethavar had encountered before. He opened with the standard Vorath framework, establish dominance position, quantify the power differential, offer the terms, allow the lesser party to respond with concessions or objections, which would then be categorically rejected before the final terms were imposed. It was a ritual, really, more than a negotiation. It had the same function as his list of titles. It was theater designed to make the outcome feel inevitable. Mara didn't engage with the framework. She listened to him, genuinely listened, which was itself unusual enough that Vel later reported being unsettled by it. And then she said, "Can I ask you something, off the formal record?" Vel had translated this and then looked at Kethavar, uncertain. Kethavar, after a pause, had said, "Proceed." "How many species," Mara asked, "have you fought that surprised you?" "A beat." "Explain," Kethavar said. "I mean genuinely surprised you. Not just tactical surprises, somebody hits a flank you didn't account for, that kind of thing. I mean a moment where you thought you understood exactly what you were dealing with, and then you realized you didn't. How many times has that happened?" The compound eyes shifted through several focal patterns in rapid succession. She watched him decide whether to answer honestly. It was fascinating. You could see him weighing it, the cost-benefit calculation, because an honest answer implied the existence of limitations, and limitations were vulnerabilities. But a dishonest answer to this question was too easy to identify as dishonest, and he was perceptive enough to know she'd clock it. "3 times, he said finally. "Okay," she nodded. "What did you do those 3 times?" "I adapted." "Right, you adapted." She tilted her head slightly. "Here's what I'm curious about, Warlord. Every single time the Accord has sent someone to talk to you, they've come in with a position, a prepared argument, a leverage point or a concession they were authorized to make. And every time you've taken about 20 minutes to identify exactly what that leverage point is and then work around it." She paused. "Am I wrong?" He didn't answer, which was its own answer. "I didn't come in with a position," she said. "I don't have leverage points to offer. Earth's actual military capability relative to yours is—" She made a small gesture with her hand. "Frankly, embarrassing. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. You have 3,000 warships. We have a defensive grid and a lot of very stubborn people." Another pause. "But here's the thing I keep thinking about." She leaned forward slightly, just slightly, not aggressive, curious. "You've already won this war strategically. Your fleet can take Earth's outer relays within 72 hours. You can have ground forces on our surface within 2 weeks and by your own projections. And I've read your projections. They were in the briefing, organized resistance collapses within 90 days. You're right about that. That's probably accurate." Kethavar was perfectly still. "But you're here," she said, "which means something in your calculation still has a variable it hasn't resolved." The silence that followed was the longest of the conversation so far. Then Vel translated something that wasn't a response to what she'd said, but was clearly directed at her. "You are not afraid." It wasn't a compliment. It was more like a scientist noting an anomalous reading. "I'm terrified," Mara said, and her voice was completely level. "I'm telling you that because it's true and because I think you can tell anyway, but being afraid doesn't change the math." Part 2, the arithmetic. Here's the part that nobody in the Accord expected. He didn't proceed to his standard second phase argument. He sat down. It was such a simple thing, a Vorath warlord, setting himself into the chair across from her, which was a gesture with about 800 years of cultural weight behind it because in Vorath tradition, You sat with equals, and none of the Cathari, none of Vel, visibly reacted because they were too professionally conditioned to visibly react, but she saw the micro-shifts, the subtle redistribution of weight, the altered alertness. She didn't react either, she just waited. You said I have an unresolved variable, he said through Vel. Yes. You are going to tell me what it is. If you want. A pause, tell me. 90-day collapse of organized resistance, she said. That's the projection. And it might be right. I'm not qualified to argue with your tactical models. You've run these numbers on more campaigns than I can count. But here's what I don't see in the projection. She held up one finger, human gesture, he tracked it. What happens on day 91? A beat of quiet. Because here's the thing about humans, she said. And I'm telling you this not as a diplomatic argument, but as a practical observation, because I think you're someone who values accurate information more than comfortable information. She held his compound-eyed gaze. We are extremely bad at staying defeated. She said it simply, not with bravado, not like a boast, just as a fact the way you'd note that water tends to run downhill. The Accord's briefings on human history, I assume you've read them. Extensively. Then you've seen the pattern. We get beaten, we lose, we absorb defeat at a scale that would, from my understanding of Vorath cultural psychology, constitute an existential psychological event for most other species. And then we come back. She paused. Not always, not every time, but with a regularity that I think your projection models haven't fully accounted for because, she stopped herself, chose her words. Because our threshold for what constitutes an unacceptable defeat is genuinely different from most species. Kethavar's hands had moved to the table. Not threateningly, they were resting on it, but she noticed the change. You are arguing, he said slowly, that conquering Earth is not the end of the campaign. I'm arguing that your 90-day figure might be correct, and it still might be wrong, because you're measuring the wrong thing. She kept her voice even. What's your model for years 2 through 10? What's your attrition estimate for maintaining a subjugated human population? What's the cost-benefit on labor productivity from a species that, historically, tends to reduce its productivity to nearly zero under conditions of coerced servitude, not out of conspiracy, but out of a kind of ornery, disorganized, individual-level refusal that's almost impossible to systematically suppress because it's not coordinated? She let that land. Your model says Earth is beaten in 90 days. She held up her hand, 2 fingers now. My model says, you spend years 2 through 10 suppressing the people your model already counted as defeated. And in year 11, something changes. I don't know what, I'm not a prophet. And you discover that 90 days was the beginning, not the end. The second hour of that meeting was different from the first. He asked questions. Not rhetorical questions, not the structured challenges of formal Vorath debate, actual questions, the kind you ask when you're trying to understand something. He asked about the Cascade Station incident, which she realized he'd read in her file. He knew what she'd done there, the 14-hour surgery sequence while the station was depressurizing around her, the 11 people who survived because she'd refused to stop. He didn't ask about it to praise her. He asked about it in the same tone he might ask about the structural tolerances of a material's alloy. At what point did you assess the situation as unwinnable? He asked. She thought about that honestly. I didn't. You assessed it as survivable throughout. No, I assessed it as, she paused, looking for the right word, unfinished. There were still people alive who needed a surgeon. The situation's winnability wasn't really the variable I was tracking. A long pause from his side of the table. What variable were you tracking? Whether there was still something useful I could do. Another pause. Vel's translation had taken on a slightly different quality, still professional, still accurate, but the interpreter's own plates had shifted into a pattern she couldn't fully read, something that might have been bewilderment. And if there had been nothing useful left to do, then I would have stopped, she said practically. You adapt to the reality in front of you, but you don't preemptively give up on a reality that hasn't arrived yet. Kethavar was quiet for a long time after that. Long enough that one of the Cathari shifted, almost imperceptibly, and she caught Vel glancing sideways at the Warlord with an expression she couldn't parse. Then he asked, why did Earth send you? It was a genuine question, she could tell. I don't know exactly, she said, and then because she believed in accurate information. I think because when they handed me the briefing, I didn't ask how bad it was. I just asked when I needed to leave. Part 3, What the Warlord Saw. I want to talk about what HFY saw, because the recording gives us his side too, and I think it's important. The Vorath had a concept. Rough translation would be the weight of a thing. Not physical weight, potential weight. The difference between an object at rest and an object moving was not, to Vorath thinking, a mechanical distinction. It was an ontological one. A compressed spring and an uncompressed spring were fundamentally different things, not just in energy state but in kind. He had a word for beings who showed very little potential weight. He had a different word for beings who showed too much of it. He'd never used the second word for a being smaller than a Vorath. He used it for mountains, for certain types of stellar phenomena, for one particular Droth elder he'd negotiated with once who had left him with the distinct sensation that he had been, for about 20 minutes, in the presence of something that could see further than him. He told Vel after she had left the room, after the meeting had concluded, that she had potential weight. Vel, to his credit, had simply said, "Yes, Warlord, I noticed that too." He did not impose terms. That was the outcome that the Accord had not prepared for because it had never happened before. He did not concede, he made that explicit. The Vorath military position was unchanged. The timeline was unchanged. But the meeting was suspended rather than concluded, and in the formal diplomatic notation that meant continuing process rather than resolved process, and it bought Earth's outer relays another 72 hours, and then another, and then another. When Chevelin met Myra at the door of the conference level, her ridge was cycling patterns so fast and complex it looked like a light show. "What happened in there?" she said. Myra walked past her toward their quarters. She was tired, the deep kind, the kind that settles in your bones after you've been running on focus and adrenaline for hours, and the adrenaline has finally started the long, slow withdrawal. "We talked," she said. "You talked," Chevelin repeated. She caught up to her, fell into step beside her. "The Vorath Dominion's diplomatic liaison sent a formal communication 2 minutes ago. I don't understand, Commander. The meeting should have concluded. The terms should have been finalized." "The protocol was." "I know what the protocol was." "Then what?" Myra stopped walking, turned to face her. "He's smart," she said. "Really smart, and he's been winning for so long that he's started to believe that winning is the same thing as being right." She looked at Chevelin carefully. "I just introduced him to the idea that he might be missing a variable, that's all." Chevelin's ridge went still. "That's all," she said flatly. "That's all." Myra started walking again. "He'll think about it. People like him, beings like him, they can't leave an unresolved variable alone. It'll itch at him." "And if it doesn't?" She considered that honestly. "Then we're back where we started, and Earth has 72 hours to prepare a defensive posture that won't hold anyway." She said it without self-pity, just calculation. "But I don't think that's what happens." "Why not?" She thought about it for a moment, about the look in those compound eyes during the last 20 minutes of the session. That shift, not agreement, not capitulation, but something rarer. The look of a mind that had encountered something it couldn't immediately categorize and had decided it was worth the processing power. "Because I think he's been waiting a long time," she said, "to be genuinely surprised." Part 4, The Return. 3 weeks. That's how long the suspension lasted before HFY's diplomatic office requested a second session. 3 weeks in which the Accord conducted themselves like people sitting in a waiting room during a very complicated surgery. Quiet conversations. Unable to make plans because any plan they made depended on a variable they didn't control. Mara spent the 3 weeks working. She pulled every piece of information on Vorath culture that the Accord's archive had. Not the military assessments, she'd absorbed those already. The anthropological records, trade histories, linguistic evolution studies. There was a Vorath scholar, now deceased, had lived 2 centuries ago, who had written at length about the philosophical underpinnings of Vorath expansionism, not as a justification for it, as an analysis. She read everything he'd written that had been translated, and then she asked the archive AI to translate 3 additional texts that hadn't been processed yet, and she read those too. She also talked to Vel. This was entirely outside protocol. Vel was the Warlord's interpreter, and informal contact between delegation members during a suspended negotiation was, at minimum, frowned upon by both sides. But she ran into him in the shared sector of the station, the commercial level where both delegations and the station's permanent residents mixed freely, and she bought him a cup of something hot that was approximately tea, and she just talked to him. Not about the negotiation, about his work. About the challenge of translation, not just linguistic translation but conceptual translation. The way some ideas existed in one language in a form that another language could only approximate. She talked about it from her own experience, the Jovian corridor period when she'd had to learn 3 alien languages in 8 months to do her medical work effectively, and the moments where she'd realized that a word in Kelvari wasn't a word. It was a compressed philosophical position that required a paragraph to approximate in standard. Vel, who had the interpreter's professional habit of listening more than speaking, ended up talking for most of an hour. He told her carefully, with caveats about his own limitations in observing things clearly when they were outside his assigned role, that the Warlord had been reading. Human history, not the strategic assessments that the Vorath intelligence services had compiled. The actual historical texts, that he had apparently consumed, in the 3 weeks of suspension, a significant portion of what humanity had recorded about its own behavior across centuries. He told her this carefully, and then he said, more carefully still, "He has questions. I think he does not yet know how to ask them." She thought about that. "Tell him I'll be at the observation deck on level 3 at station evening tomorrow. If he happens to be there, we can talk off the record." Vel was quiet for a long moment. "Then, that is not something I can formally communicate." "I know, but you can informally not remember hearing it." He looked at her with the compound-eyed stillness that the Vorath used when they were processing something unexpected. Then he drank his tea. She went to the observation deck at station evening. It was one of the station's concessions to its mixed population, a large transparent dome showing actual space, which was a significant engineering commitment in a structure this old. The star field outside was dense. This was an older region of the galaxy, relatively speaking, and the stars were close enough that several were visible as disks rather than points. She sat on a bench near the edge of the dome. The artificial gravity was standard, the air was temperature neutral, and it was very quiet. The permanent residents had their own schedule rhythms and station evening fell in a shift gap, so the deck was mostly empty. He came alone, no Cathari, no Vel. Just him, filling the doorway for a moment, those compound eyes catching the starlight in ways that made them look like they contained multitudes, which she supposed in a sense they did. He crossed the deck and sat on the far end of the bench, because the bench was actually long enough to comfortably seat a Vorath, and it was the only piece of furniture in the room that would hold his weight. They sat without speaking for a moment, looking at the stars. Then he said in standard, accented careful, clearly learned rather than native but standard, "Your people wrote things down." She turned to look at him. He was watching the stars. "We did," she said. "Everything, battles, losses, mistakes." He paused. "We keep records also, but our records are the word curated, what was won, what was gained." "We keep the failures," she agreed. "I don't know if it makes us better, but it means we know what went wrong." Another silence. "I read your history of a war, 2,000 years ago approximately by your timekeeping, a war in your northern lands. A large coalition force was defeated repeatedly over years." And then he paused, and she realized he was looking for the word. "The defeated side won." "That's a lot of our wars," she said carefully. "This one," he seemed to be accessing memory, "involved a leader who was exiled to an island." "Napoleon." "He returned from the island." The compound eyes shifted. "Why did they allow him to return?" She thought about it. They underestimated the degree to which the people who had already lost would still follow someone who represented the possibility of winning. People don't transfer their loyalty based on the scoreboard. It's more complicated than that. A long pause. "Yes," he said, and something in the timbre of the word was different. "I am beginning to understand that." They talked for 2 hours in the dark with the stars outside. Not negotiating, just talking. She answered his questions about Cascade Station, about the Jovian corridor, about her grandmother, which surprised her when she found herself telling him about it, but he'd asked about what she thought of during difficult situations, and it was the honest answer. He listened with the particular quality of attention that she'd noticed in the conference room. Absolute, unfiltered. None of the tactical maneuvering that most powerful people couldn't help performing even in casual conversation. He talked too, not much, but some. He told her about a campaign early in his career, his second major engagement, where he had made a significant tactical error that cost him a third of his fleet. He described the incident in terms of the learning, not the loss, which was the Vorath way. But underneath the framing, she could hear something that she thought was the Vorath equivalent of something humans would call regret. She didn't say anything about it, she just listened. Near the end, he asked her something that she hadn't expected. "Why are you not angry with us?" She thought about it, genuinely thought about it, sitting there in the dark with the stars outside, because it deserved a genuine answer. "I am a little," she said. "Not at you specifically, at the situation, at the fact that this is how it has to work, power and the demonstration of power all the way up. But anger isn't what I'm here to express." She paused. "And I don't think you're a monster. I think you're someone who became very good at a specific thing, in a specific context, and the thing that you became good at is now the only tool in the box." A silence. That is, he considered, an accurate description of a limitation. "Yeah," she looked at the stars. "I think recognizing your limitations is underrated. Most people, most beings, treat it like a weakness. But knowing what your instruments can't measure is the most important thing you can know." Part 5, What Came Next? The formal second session happened 5 days later. The Accord didn't know what to expect. Chevelin had briefed the diplomatic council in terms that amounted to something as shifted, but we cannot assess which was not a briefing any of them found comforting. The Vorath diplomatic office had been uncharacteristically quiet. Military movement in the outer relay systems had paused, not withdrawn. She walked into the same conference room, same cold blue light, same obsidian table. He was already there, which had never happened before in any recorded Vorath negotiation. The dominant party always arrived last. It was protocol, it was cultural, it was as automatic as breathing. He was sitting. She sat down across from him. Vel was there, standing slightly off to the side, with an expression she was starting to be able to read. Vel's expression said, "I also do not know what is happening right now, but I am watching very carefully." Cathavar spoke, and Vel translated, though the Warlord's own standard was present in the room like a second layer beneath the translation. "I have spent 3 weeks considering the variable you identified." "And," she said, "the variable is legitimate. My projection models for post-conquest population management have a structural error. The error is," a pause, "that they were built on data from species with different parameters than your species exhibits." "Which parameters specifically?" she asked, because she wanted to hear him say it. A long silence, then. "The relationship between defeat and abandonment of purpose. In every other species I have data for, sustained defeat correlates with progressive abandonment of resistance purpose. The curve is predictable. Your species," another pause, "does not exhibit this correlation." "No," she agreed, "we don't. My models cannot accurately predict the cost of occupation for a population with non-standard defeat response parameters," he said. It was as close to "I was wrong" as Vorath linguistic convention allowed. She waited. "I have a proposition," he said. She waited. Not a negotiation, a proposition, different in structure. He held her gaze, those compound eyes steady. "Earth is not absorbed into the Dominion as a labor class. Earth is," he searched for the word in standard, "associated, a different relationship, not subjugation, something closer to, I believe your people use the word, alliance." The silence in the room was enormous. She kept her face even, because the thing she felt right now was a complicated emotion that needed to stay internal and not add confusion to the moment. "What does associated mean specifically, terms?" He outlined them. It took 20 minutes with back and forth for clarification, but the core was, Earth retained governing authority over its own systems. There would be a Vorath liaison presence, not a garrison, a liaison whose function was coordination, not occupation. Earth would have access to Vorath trade networks. The Vorath Dominion would have access to human populations, and this was the part that took the most careful translation. as advisors on conflict situations exhibiting non-standard resolution parameters. He wanted humans, basically, as consultants, for situations where his projection models didn't work. Because apparently somewhere in 3 weeks of reading human history and one conversation in the dark about Napoleon, Kethavar of the Vorath Dominion had concluded that whatever it was that made humans different, whatever particular configuration of stubbornness and adaptability and refusal to stay defeated, was worth more to him associated than it was conquered. She sat with that for a moment, really sat with it. Then she said, "I need to consult with my delegation before I can agree to anything formally. You know that." "Of course." But she held his gaze. "Off the record, I think we can find terms that work, both directions." Vel translated. The complex expression on his face had resolved into something she couldn't name but which felt, across all the species difference, like something she would call relief. Part 6, what HFY said. When Mara walked into the Accord delegation suite, Chevelin was already standing, because the real-time alert from the session recording had lit up her console 30 seconds into Kethavar's proposition, and she'd been standing ever since. She looked at Mara. Her bioluminescent ridge was doing something Mara had never seen it do, cycling through every color in its range in a slow, almost involuntary cascade. "He proposed an alliance," Chevelin said. "An association. There's a technical distinction." "An association with Earth." Chevelin's voice was doing something complicated. "Kethavar, who has never, in 42 formal negotiations, ever proposed anything other than terms of subjugation." "I know. You walked into that room. I know. With no leverage, no military capacity, no." "Sheva," Mara sat down. She was exhausted, genuinely, the kind of exhaustion that wasn't the absence of sleep but the presence of sustained alertness for too long and the aftermath of keeping every single response calibrated for hours on end. "I know what I walked in with." Chevelin sat down across from her. Her ridge had settled into a single, steady, warm color, something Mara associated with the Kelvari expression that roughly translated as "I am not going to be able to describe how I feel about this, so I'm just going to feel it for a minute." "How," Chevelin said quietly, "how did you do it?" Mara thought about that for a moment. "I didn't treat him like a problem to be solved," she said. "I treated him like a person to be understood, and then I said true things to him." She paused. "And I think part of it was that he hasn't encountered many people who would just say true things to him without wrapping them in strategy. Because when you're powerful enough, everything people say to you is a negotiating position. Everything is angled." She was quiet for a second. "I wasn't angled, I was just there, and I think," she stopped herself, reconsidered. "I think he's been lonely in a way he doesn't have a word for. That sounds strange, I know. But I think at a certain level of power, you stop being able to have conversations because every conversation is transactional. And I just," she gestured inadequately, "talk to him." Chevelin's ridge was very still. "You made a friend," she said, "of Kethavar of the Vorath Dominion." "I wouldn't go that far." "What would you go?" Mara considered. "I would say we have the beginning of an understanding, which is the only honest foundation for anything more." Part 7, the Gallery. What the Accord called the Gallery was a specific archive that the Accord's diplomatic services maintained, not publicly accessible, institutional use only, which contained records of every formal contact event between member species. Significant events were flagged, documented, analyzed. The Meridian Threshold meeting was flagged. But it was flagged in a category that had only been used twice before in the Accord's 400-year history: Paradigm Contact Event, which was the archive's terminology for a moment that changed the fundamental shape of interspecies relations rather than adjusting the existing shape. The file included the audio transcript, Vel's written report, and a lengthy analysis from the Accord's Senior Diplomatic Council. 14 species, 47 systems, all of them working from the same source material and arriving at a version of the same conclusion. The conclusion was this: a human representative, entering a negotiation with no conventional leverage, operating against a party with total military advantage, achieved a fundamental reorientation of the opposing party's strategic framework through methods that the Accord's standard diplomatic models cannot fully account for. The analysis attempted to identify which specific techniques had produced this outcome. It couldn't. Not because the techniques were hidden, the recording was clear, the transcript was verbatim, but because what Mara had done was not, technically, a technique. It was more like a condition, a state of being in the room in a particular way that produced particular effects. The analysis offered several frameworks for understanding this, each with significant caveats. The most frequently cited was from a Kelvari diplomatic theorist who had written, decades before this event, about what he called the paradox of witnessed vulnerability, which was his term for the phenomenon where a party that openly acknowledges its own limitations in a high-stakes context produces a crisis of framework in the opposing party that conventional strength cannot produce. The theory was that most interspecies negotiations were, fundamentally, performances. Both parties performing strength, performing certainty, performing the role that their position required. And that the performance created a kind of mutual theater that was very difficult to break out of, because breaking character was itself a vulnerability signal. What Mara had done was not break character. She'd never been in character to begin with. She'd walked in as herself, a woman from Silesia by way of Germany, with a scar above her left eyebrow and a grandmother's voice in her head. And the absence of performance in someone who had every reason to perform had created, in Kethavar, something the analyst called ontological confusion. He didn't know what category to put her in. And because he didn't know, his pre-built responses couldn't engage. And because his pre-built responses couldn't engage, he had to actually think. And the thinking led somewhere that 42 previous negotiations had never led. The final line of the analysis read, "It should be noted that the outcome of this event cannot be guaranteed to replicate with different human representatives, and should not be treated as a reproducible diplomatic technique. What LT Commander Voss brought to the Meridian threshold cannot be trained or systematized. It can only be recognized in the individuals who possess it and allowed to operate." Part 8. What Mara thought about. She was on the transport home, back through the Kelvari-scented air, back toward Earth's relay stations, which were still standing, when Chevelin found her in the common room. Chevelin sat down across from her and watched her for a moment. Mara was looking out the window at the moving starfield, a cup of something warm held in both hands. "What are you thinking about?" Chevelin asked. Mara considered the question. "My grandmother's bread recipe," she said. Chevelin's ridge flickered. "I beg your pardon." "She never wrote it down. She always meant to. And then she died before she did, and nobody else who made it the way she did is alive now." She paused. "I was thinking about what we lose when we don't write things down, and I was thinking about how the Vorath don't write down their failures and what that costs them. And then I was thinking about my grandmother's bread." Chevelin was quiet for a moment. "Is that how your mind works? These chains of association? Doesn't everyone's?" "No," Chevelin seemed genuinely surprised. "No, Commander, not like that." Mara sipped her drink. What, I was just thinking, I wonder if that's part of it, the way we think." She was talking more to herself than to Chevelin. "Not the strategy, not any specific skill, just the way one thing leads to another thing leads to a thing you weren't expecting. The associative," she gestured vaguely. "The mess of it, the chaos. The fact that when I'm sitting in a room with a Vorath warlord, some part of my brain is simultaneously thinking about my grandmother." She paused. "Maybe that's what he couldn't categorize, not because I'm strategic, because I'm not. I'm a whole person in the room, with all the whole person clutter that comes with it." Chevelin was very still. "And maybe that clutter is what makes it real," Mara said. "What makes it not a performance? Because you can't perform the grandmother's bread recipe part. That's not in any negotiation manual." She looked at Chevelin. "Sorry, I'm tired. I'm thinking out loud." "Don't apologize." Chevelin's ridge was doing the cascading warm color again. "Please don't apologize." Part 9. Dispatch. "There's one more thing I want to tell you." 6 months after the Meridian threshold, after the formal association agreement was signed in a ceremony that was attended by representatives of all 14 Accord species, with Kethavar present in person for the signing, a historical event so anomalous that 2 separate Accord archivists apparently experienced physical symptoms of shock when they received the notification. Earth sent a small delegation to the Vorath Dominion. Not military, not diplomatic exactly. 5 people, selected from a pool of applicants. The criteria written by Mara, which she was careful to specify as non-negotiable. Must be someone who, when handed a difficult situation with no guaranteed outcome, asks, "What's useful I can do," rather than "How bad is this?" That was the only criterion. She got 432 applications. She read every one. The 5 she selected were a trauma surgeon from Nairobi, a conflict mediator from Osaka, a former resistance fighter from Kiev who had retrained as a civil engineer, a deep-sea marine biologist from Cape Town who had spent 20 years studying organisms that lived in conditions previously considered incompatible with life, and a 17-year-old girl from rural Oaxaca who had, after her village was devastated by flooding, rebuilt its water infrastructure using materials sourced from the flood debris. None of them had diplomatic credentials. None of them had military records. Mara's note accompanying the delegation file, submitted to the Accord Oversight Committee, read, "You asked for people who represent what Earth is. These are people who represent what Earth is." Kethavar received them on his flagship. He received them in a chamber that was, by Vorath standards, intimate. A meeting room rather than a formal hall, no ceremonial guard, just himself and Vel and 2 aides. He met each of them individually, asked each of them one question, different question, for each person drawn from their file. Questions that were, Vel later noted, not tests, just genuine curiosity. The questions you ask when you want to understand someone rather than assess them. After the 5th meeting, he stood for a long moment in the corridor outside the meeting room, and Vel, who had been his interpreter for 11 years, who had seen him in 42 negotiations and 300 campaign briefings, and the quiet hours aboard the flagship that no one wrote into official records, stood nearby and waited. "She selected them," Kethavar said finally in his own language. "Yes, Warlord. She selected them the same way," a pause, "the same quality." "I believe so." He looked at the corridor wall for a moment. It was an interesting thing to watch, this being who had built a career on certainty, standing with something that was visibly not certainty on his face. Not doubt, not uncertainty exactly. Something more like the first moment of a very long look at a question he hadn't finished forming. "Find out," he said slowly, "if there are materials I can access, their philosophy, their what is the word?" He searched in Standard, couldn't find it, reverted to Vorath. Vel translated it roughly as, "The thing they tell each other about how to keep going when there is no reason left to keep going." "I believe," Vel said, "that would be found in their literature, their religious texts, their philosophy. There is a great deal of material." "Good," a pause, "and their music." Vel blinked, "Warlord." "Their music," Kethavar was already walking. "Get me their music." Epilogue, the line that holds. I found out about the music part a year later. I found out because Vel told me, in one of the semi-regular communications we'd established by then, not official Accord channels, just a correspondence that had grown out of that cup of tea on the observation level. We wrote to each other every few weeks. He had a quality of attention in his writing that I'd come to rely on, a way of describing things that cut through to the essential. He told me that Kethavar had, over the course of several months, worked through a significant portion of human musical history, and that the Vorath Dominion's analysts, tasked with evaluating the strategic implications of the association agreement, had flagged this as an anomalous data point with no clear strategic significance. And that Kethavar had looked at that flag and said, in the particular tone he used when he was being intentionally opaque, "Correct, note it as a personal matter." Vel's communication didn't tell me what music he'd gravitated toward. He said he thought it would be better for me to find that out another way if I found it out at all, because some things had a different quality when they arrived unexpectedly. I thought about writing and asking directly. I didn't. I decided I agreed with Vel. But I thought about it, the image of it. A 3-meter Vorath warlord sitting alone in some quiet hour on his flagship listening to whatever it was. I thought about what it meant, not diplomatically, not strategically, just as a human moment, or whatever the Vorath version of a human moment is. A person sitting with music that isn't theirs, trying to hear what it says. That's not nothing. That's in fact the beginning of something very large. Chevelin asked me once, near the end of the second negotiation cycle, whether I thought we'd done the right thing. She meant the association agreement, the terms, whether Earth had given enough or given too much, whether the Accord species were right to sanction it or should have held out for a more conventional arrangement that preserved clearer boundaries. She asked it in the careful, diplomatic way she had of asking real questions, wrapping them in professional language just enough to give them plausible deniability. I told her I didn't know. That's the honest answer. I still don't know. History takes a long time to tell you whether you did the right thing, sometimes longer than a human lifetime, and I'm only 35. But here's what I do know. When I was in that room, the first time, the cold blue light, the obsidian table, the being across from me who could end Earth's independence by making one signal to his fleet, I was afraid. Genuinely. Deep, physical, old animal afraid, the kind of fear that lives in the brainstem and doesn't care what your prefrontal cortex thinks. And I thought of my grandmother, her voice, her cracked hands, her bread that nobody remembered how to make anymore. The thunder doesn't know you're scared, so you don't have to show it. And I held that and I walked in. Not because I was brave. Bravery gets misunderstood constantly. People think it's the absence of fear, and it isn't. Bravery is doing the thing while the fear is still there, because the thing is what needs doing, because there is still something useful you can do. And that's it. That's the whole secret, if there is one. There isn't a technique. There isn't a framework. There's just this. You go to the room, you tell the truth, you look at the person in front of you like they're a person worth understanding, and you do not leave until the thing that needs doing is done or it genuinely cannot be done anymore. That's not special. Every human I know is capable of that. Most humans I know have done that, in a room much smaller and much more personal than the one I sat in, and nobody wrote an Accord diplomatic report about it. They just lived their lives. They held the line. They kept going past the point where the math said stop. That's what we are. That's what we've always been. The galaxy just hadn't met us properly yet. The Meridian Threshold Association Agreement was ratified by Earth's Governing Council on the 14th of March, and by the Vorath Dominion Command Authority 4 days later. The Accord recognized it as a full-standing diplomatic arrangement, the first of its kind between a Dominion power and an Accord member species. The delegation Mara Voss selected, 5 humans, none of them diplomats, spent the following 18 months in the Vorath Dominion, and returned with 43 separate proposals for collaborative projects, of which 31 were eventually implemented. The deep-sea biologist from Cape Town, it later turned out, had spent the 3rd week of her visit in a long conversation with a Vorath xenobiologist about creatures that survive conditions that should kill them. They filed a joint research proposal 6 months after returning home. It was the first interspecies academic collaboration in Accord history. Vel and Mara Voss corresponded for 11 years. He told her eventually what music Kethavar had landed on. She laughed for a long time when she found out. Then she cried a little. She didn't explain why to anyone, and nobody who knew her well enough asked. She kept her grandmother's bread recipe in a document on her personal server, reconstructed over several years from memory and experimentation, probably not exactly right, but close enough that it tasted like the memory of it. She shared it with Chevelin, who had expressed curiosity. Chevelin made it, despite not eating human food, and said it was difficult to describe, but that the making of it was. And here she used a Kelvari word that the translation software rendered as layered, a layered experience. The thunder, as it turned out, had been paying attention all along. It just didn't know what to do with what it heard.